Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining in for this webinar. It's being organized by the National Organization for Women, Young Feminists and Allies, which is the first virtual chapter of NOW. NOW is the largest multi-issue women's rights organization in the country. And what sets us apart from other organizations is that we are completely democratic. So now members decide on who the leaders are, what issues we focus on, and how we go about focusing on those issues. We have wonderful women's rights organizations around the country, like NARAL and Planned Parenthood, and we need both types of organizations. So NARAL and Planned Parenthood are not necessarily direct democracy, but we need organizations that provide services to have institutional knowledge, to have long-term staff and leaders. But we also need organizations like NOW, the National Organization for Women, who are completely based on direct democracy. So that people like me, when I used to be undocumented, I was on the national board of NOW. By having a direct democratic structure, it is a more inclusive way for people to be leaders and get involved. So when I was a poor college student with and undocumented, and I'm also a Muslim feminist, all those things might be difficult for me to assume a leadership role in other organizations, but because NOW is direct democracy, I was able to be on the national board and able to start the first virtual chapter. So the first virtual chapter is called Young Feminists and Allies, and we focus on the leadership of young people. It's called Young Feminists and Allies because it's open to everybody, any age. But we focus on centering the leadership of young people. We wholeheartedly believe that young people are our future, not just in a cliched way, but because, and not just biologically, but because they tend to be more progressive and they are building on the activism that we've done and the generations before us have done. Like, I know I'm standing on the shoulders of my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation and the generations before that. So right now we have the fourth wave of feminism. Yes, there is a fourth wave. The fourth wave is even more bold and brave and inclusive than the third wave. So fourth wave feminists are people like Ashita Kumar in Michigan, who started her own high school NOW club. And she and her group organized a conference with 150 people, including their state senator. And she was 15 when she did this. That is the fourth wave of feminism. That is the future that we can all look forward to. And that's why our chapter focuses on the leadership of young people, because they don't necessarily need to learn from us. We just need to create opportunities and spaces so that they can lead. So that is kind of a nutshell about the Young Feminists and Allies NOW chapter. We've been around for about 5 years. We started the chapter because we felt that young people's leadership was not being centered the way it should be. And we've had just the most amazing members, like the 16-year-old who created the conference when she was 15, and other really amazing young activists across the country. And one of the things we do in the chapter is hold these webinars. Since we are the first virtual chapter, we try to leverage technology to reach people who may not be able to go somewhere physically, and to really reach people and connect with people from across the country. Speaking of which, we have a really exciting panel today. There's Maya Raghu, who works for the National Women's Law Center, and she is the director of Workplace Equity and Senior Counsel. She has a lot of experience when it comes to gender-based discrimination. She is leading their workplace equality initiative. She also worked for Legal Momentum, where she worked on gender-based discrimination and violence. So attorneys who are in this field look at sexual harassment as on the same wavelength of gender-based discrimination. So sexual harassment is the more serious form of gender-based discrimination. And sexual violence is also the most extreme form of gender-based discrimination. So legally, that's the framework, is that sexual harassment and other forms of sexual harassment is considered a form of gender-based discrimination. It's all in the spectrum of violence that maybe on the most benign part might be an unwanted hello on the street, to the most extreme, which is the femicide of women. And so legally, that's how we look at gender-based, look at sexual harassment as a form of discrimination. And it should be given as much importance as other forms of discrimination, like racial discrimination or discrimination based on religion. We actually have on the panel, Allegra Michelle, and please forgive me if I'm butchering anybody's name. Allegra is the founder and executive director of the Gender Equality Law Center, and she has a lot of experience representing victims of gender-based discrimination. And so that includes, what we think about more traditionally as sexual harassment, which is, a man making unwanted sexual advances toward a woman. But really, sexual harassment includes so much more than that. It also includes discriminating against somebody because of their gender identity or sexual preference. So the entire LGBTQAI spectrum is included in that protection against gender-based discrimination. We also have, as Allegra will talk more about, the legal definitions and kind of the nuances of gender-based discrimination and sexual harassment. We also have on our panel, Shannon Lee, who is a writer, journalist, and survivor activist. Shannon has a lot of expertise in this area from many different angles. Shannon is a survivor of sexual harassment herself. She has written extensively about this, and especially leveraging her experience as a human resource professional. So she also brings that angle into this conversation. And I have personally learned so much from Shannon about the contribution of Black women into not only the Me Too movement, but the entire sexual violence movement for centuries, which I didn't know. So I'm excited to hear from Shannon about that and learn more. So some housekeeping for those of you who actually logged into the YouTube, you can actually chat questions to us. And we have one of our officers from the Young Feminists and Allies chapter is fielding those questions and will send those to me. You can also tweet at us with any questions you have. Our Twitter is now Young Fems. That's NOWYOUNGFEMS. You can also post on our Facebook page if you have any questions. We really want this to be an interactive discussion, and we're intentionally breaking down legal things in layman terms so that it's accessible to other people. So I would like to turn it over to Allegra. Allegra, if you could please give more of an introduction of who you are and your organization and what you do, that would be great.
Okay, thanks very much, Jaren. As Jaren introduced me, my name is Allegra Fischel. I am the founder and the executive director of the Gender Equality Law Center, which is a not-for-profit legal and advocacy organization. We work to break down barriers created in all aspects of public and private life that limit opportunities for individuals on the basis of gender. Our work consists of a blend of litigation, more traditional legal work, legislative initiatives, community outreach, training, and we try to use all of those different initiatives to help push the law and advance the law to be more protective of women, girls, and members of one or more LGBTQ plus communities. So Jaren had asked me before this webinar to talk a little bit about what is sexual harassment in the workplace. It's something we hear as a term all the time, and a lot of folks just don't really understand it. There's a lot of confusion. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit. First, I'm going to start with some legal standards. Basically, sexual harassment in the workplace can include sexual advances, requests for sexual behavior, or other physical or verbal harassment of a sexual nature. There are two ways that harassment occurs in the workplace. One is that an individual can be directly harassed. For instance, their supervisor could be propositioning them, or a direct supervisor or manager or even a coworker can be creating an environment that's very sexualized or objectifies them. But you don't have to be approached one-on-one to have a sexual harassment, to have sexual harassment in the workplace. A hostile work environment, which is kind of the term of art, can be created because the entire environment is hostile to women. It can be the kinds of conversations. It can be because there's pornography in the workplace. It can be because someone else is being targeted. But the law also protects individuals who are forced to experience that kind of sexualized work environment. What sexual harassment is not, it is not flirtation between employees. It's not being interested in someone else to even have a sexual relationship. It's not about pursuing romance. This is a complete misnomer. It's typically about an abuse of power that puts primarily women, but certainly not exclusively women, in a situation in which the very essence of their work environment is tainted by gender bias. And I actually prefer the term gender harassment rather than sexual harassment, because it is generally not something that someone is advancing to make a woman feel better or more welcome in the workplace. It's usually about a power dynamic. There are really two important concepts to understand about sexual harassment that would differentiate it from the normal kinds of relationship feelings people may legitimately have in the workplace. Is the conduct has to be unwelcome. So if someone pursues you or is interested in you and you welcome it, it's not sexual harassment, it's workplace relationships. The other is the conduct that is occurring either directly from another person, the environment more generally, has to make your job more difficult for you, has to create a hostile work environment, has to in some way impair your ability to thrive in the workplace. If you don't mind a certain kind of banter, if you don't mind certain kinds of jokes, if you don't mind the pornography being posted on the wall near your desk, then that's actually not sexual harassment. Typically, at least under the federal laws, the conduct either has to be severe, meaning something fairly egregious happens. Assaults are almost always considered severe, or a certain kind of direct proposition. If you don't sleep with me, I'm going to demote you. Or they have to be relatively repetitive, meaning that day in and day out, you are subjected to kind of hostile and demeaning environment that has to be premised on your gender. And if I didn't make that clear, I'm sorry. If you are just harassed because someone doesn't like you, that's not gender-based harassment. It has to be targeted to you because of your gender. I just want to give a couple of really quick statistics about why this is such an important issue. This is not something that happens to just a few people in the workplace. According to the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is the agency that's charged with investigating and processing charges of sexual harassment under Title VII of the federal law, Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. If you count in all the individual employees who experience some type of gender-based discrimination, approximately 60% of women experience some type of gender-based discrimination during the course of their years of employment. 60%, that's more than half of all women that go to work every day experience gender-based discrimination. Also, according to the EEOC, of 60% of women that may experience this kind of behavior, only 30% feel safe enough to venture forward and complain within their own workplaces. So that means less than one of 3 women that experience harassment on the job can go and get some type of relief by complaining to someone in their company. Only 8 to 13% of that group will actually go outside the company, go to an agency, go to court, or be lucky enough to find a lawyer who can represent them. So I just want to make one other point, which is the victim and the harasser can be the same sex. A lot of people don't think about sexual harassment as same-sex harassment, but actually the statistics pertaining to the LGBTQ plus community are even, studies have been done to show that 1/3 of LGBT employees who are out at work are harassed on the basis of their sexual orientation or their failure to adhere to some type of gender stereotype. In the transgender and gender nonconforming group of employees, at least 50% are harassed at some point during their employment, and up to 7% are actually physically assaulted. And this is not necessarily or even at all based on some kind of sexual interest. This type of harassment is almost entirely based on animus and discomfort with people who may not conform to stereotypes that the majority of people may be comfortable with. So that's kind of an overview of why this is so important and the type of conduct that is actionable, is illegal, and conduct which is not.
Yeah, this is really helpful. We will be asking questions after the panelists get their presentation, but I did want to just repeat something you said, which was sexual harassment is not about romance. It's not about pursuing romance or flirting. That there has to be a sinister quality to it, where the harasser is trying to intimidate or embarrass or harass the victim. Right? It's not the normal, you find somebody attractive at work and you ask them out and that sort of thing. Because that is something we get a lot of questions on and a lot of pushback on. So one of the questions we received was, is it sexual harassment if I ask a colleague out and they say no, and then I back off? The fact that is that still sexual harassment?
Well, the best answer for any lawyer to give is always it depends. But based on a straightforward understanding of your question, the answer would be no. Because the person, the asker for going out, is presumably expressing some interest in the other employee and is willing to back off once the employee says no. However, what if the person who's asking to go out with the other employee happens to be a high-level supervisor? I think that that could make another employee feel extremely uncomfortable because the power dynamic is going to create concern, I think, for the employee being asked out. If I say no, am I going to be in trouble? If I say no, am I going to offend my supervisor or boss? So I don't think that innocent, requests to go out on a date or just to go out for a cup of coffee are necessarily sexual harassment. But I always think when you take into account the power discrepancy between a supervisor and a supervisee, you're inviting potential problems. Because really the question boils down to, can the employee really say no without ramifications? If you go to a bar and somebody asks you out, you can say no, and there's not going to be ramifications to your job. If you say no to your boss, is your job still going to be safe? Is your boss going to view this as a perfectly acceptable rejection of the invitation? So I think power dynamics are threaded through every aspect of workplace relationships.
Can I add something, Jaren?
Please.
Really quickly. So to Allegra's point, she brought up, if someone asks you out in a bar, I just wanted to add that, for people working in the service industry, sexual harassment by customers is a real issue as well. And under the law, employers can be held liable for customers or vendors or other people that are harassing their employees if the employer knows about it and doesn't do anything about it. So sometimes there's a power dynamic between employees and customers as well, especially if they're regular customers, and employees sometimes feel like they can't say no, or they feel like they have to say yes to get tips.
That's a really excellent point. And so I think my example might not have been the perfect one, but I really meant two customers in a setting or at a party where there's no ramifications to saying no, not the employee and the customer. And, a lot of people who experience sexual harassment in the workplace really are so often trapped by their fear of being able to reject the harasser, because they can potentially lose benefits or even lose their job or lose a promotion or be demoted. And that makes it an extremely tricky situation in which to really give full freedom for someone to say, no, I don't want to go out with you.
Thank you both. We'll have more questions toward the end of the webinar. I would love to ask Shannon actually to, Allegra gave us the foundation of legally what is sexual harassment and what isn't. I would love Shannon Lee, whom, as I mentioned, is a writer, journalist, and survivor activist, to give us the history of the Me Too movement and how we got here where we can even have these conversations that just weren't happening before. And also to speak about the contributions of Black women to the anti-violence movement for all of us, not just the Me Too movement, and the added dimension of oppression that Black women face when it comes to gender-based discrimination.
Well, thank you, Jaren. I've written recently, and I think any journalist that covers gender justice or any type of social issues has had, their fair share of coverage over the past year about Me Too, which is consistently in the headlines. And so I actually had the opportunity to write a piece for Healthline, which is called "There's No Me Too Without Black Women." And the purpose of the piece was really just to emphasize how Black women have laid the groundwork for this social movement and for the formation of rape crisis centers really out of necessity. A lot of these issues stem from things that were happening during early U.S. history, during slavery. And so I really wrote about how Me Too is the evolution of the early anti-rape movement in the U.S. And that incorporates everything from the stories that were documented by slaves at the time who either were survivors of rape or, were basically escaped a situation. Maybe they ran away or they hid, and they really escaped these situations where they were threatened with rape. And just really this pushback, because there's always kind of this conception that there's this overall conception of slavery that there are things that were going on that were just terribly violent, and the slaves weren't doing anything about it. And that's a misconception. There was a lot of things that were happening during that time. There were a lot of people that did come forward, even though obviously there was a risk of them being killed, and not just them being killed, but their families being killed, their children being sold, these types of things. So the article really incorporated just kind of the whole concept of what was happening then, of some of these early social activists, including Ida B. Wells, who really did a whole lot of work. At the time, it was seen as she was a part of the anti-lynching movement, but it was really she was really part of the anti-rape movement, because the whole her passion was really getting these stories out, because there was such a history of Black men being lynched on the basis of any accusation of rape committed against a white woman. And it didn't have to be true. And so it was really just kind of trying to fight that just violent discrimination. And so she done some early work. Oh gosh, there's other people throughout history. Rosa Parks. She also had a place in the anti-rape movement. She was also an activist that worked in that area. And there's just a lot that we don't know about history, and we don't know about that has really occurred over decades, And so in the article, I talk about misogynoir, the unique issues that Black women deal with, having any type of race and gender discrimination that ties in together. And so it's really this insidious thing that really causes us a lot of stress. It leads to a lot of our health issues. And so this is why we consistently have these high rates of depression, heart disease, maternal death. It's something that's still relevant today, and really relevant today. And so so that was kind of covered in this article as well. And also just really the emphasis on staying aware of how Me Too is using the strategies that were created by these early anti-rape activists. Because a lot of times with social movements, we don't have to recreate the wheel. And we do need to figure out how our ancestors were able to create so much change and impact society without social media, without the ability, to reach each other, on their cell phones. And we're really fostered these national movements, but also gain international support. There are stories of all of these people. A lot of artists are activists, and so you hear about these stories of James Baldwin being in Tanzania, and Maya Angelou being in these various countries in Africa. And they didn't get there alone. They gained support internationally, and we need to understand how they collaborated, and certainly draw on that while crediting those who really invented those strategies, because we want to make sure that we are still being inclusive. We want to make sure that we are telling real stories from history, so that everyone feels like they have a voice in this movement. Everyone feels empowered by this movement, and everyone feels like they have a role in creating lasting social change. So but it's when it comes to sexual harassment, and I'll talk a little bit about this briefly, but in my background, I did work in HR, And I actually left that field because I didn't feel empowered to help employees. And I went into it being really idealistic and young and thinking that, oh, sure, if an employee reports something, then I'll just, go through the chain of command and make sure that, that whoever is, committing this is penalized. And it just doesn't happen that way because there are so many, companies that are just focused on the bottom line. And so, I saw so many different things happening, and I don't even want to, there's the prevalence is for women to be impacted by this more than men, but certainly there are also men that are discriminated against and sexually harassed. And so we had, I had so many stories. I had a woman that was, just hired, and she was actually terminated quite quickly because she was sending inappropriate photos to a male executive. So, there's so many different levels to this and so many different subtleties that it does kind of get confusing. For me, I took myself out of that career field because, like I said, I didn't feel empowered to help employees in a meaningful way. And I was really just discouraged by how many people come forward, as it's already been mentioned, and there is no remedy. And so when we think about resolution, it is really hard to know the truth and understand how difficult it can be, even if you are privileged, because there's plenty of people that are in a position where, they need that job. And they're not going to report whether they're, undocumented, whether it took them several years just to get that job. I know plenty of people who have been incarcerated, or they just don't have the skills to get jobs at a certain level. So once they land them, they do not leave them, unless they're forced to leave them. So they would stay in a situation where, they're sexually harassed, and they'll just kind of deal with that. So when you're talking about reporting, you're already coming from a place of privilege, and it really needs to be those who are in a position to create change, to speak out and to do things about this. Regardless of what's happening, I think it's always important, even if you don't think you can do anything about your situation, to at least be documenting what's happening and the illegal things that are happening in your workplace. At least have that for your own records. My personal experience of sexual harassment, I've also written about, which was during my time in the military. And that is definitely a situation where you are, you're experiencing entrapment. You cannot just quit the military. You can report what's happening, but that is probably not going to make a difference because you're reporting through this chain of command, and all of these people are friends. So it's not going to do you any good. So, but I don't tend to give a whole lot of statistics these days because I just feel like there's so much information out there. We're almost overwhelmed by it. But I did, I will give examples of how, before I even got to my base, I was encouraged to talk with my supervisor and told about his sexual preference for Black women, and given little hints that he would definitely be attracted to me. And so I went into an environment where I was already integrating it. It was all male, and these are older white males. And so it was a really, just a really difficult experience in my life. So when we talk about, these hostile workplace environments, it was definitely that. And so there were times, and I can remember, taking all of my breaks just to there was one bathroom at the far end of the building that that I could just kind of hold myself in and just, and just stay far away because we would do these 2-person shifts. And so he would make sure to, and these were late night shifts that he would make sure to schedule himself with me. And I didn't want to be anywhere around him. So anytime that I wasn't, doing my job where he couldn't interact with me, I would just hide in the bathroom. And so, these are the types of things that can happen. But even at the executive level, I did a recent interview with about 7 different female executives. So they talked about the changes that have happened, even just from the time of when Anita Hill testified in 1991. They remember how different the workplace environment was then. And I kept hearing these stories of, oh, we would be in the boardroom and we'd be having these meetings, these crucial meetings. And because I was the only woman, the men didn't want me there. And so these men would take their conversations, but it was really business that they were attending to. They would take them into the bathroom so that she couldn't be a part of, the decisions in the company. And so, fast forward to 2018, these decades later, we're seeing Dr. Ford testify to try and prevent another, person from becoming U.S. Supreme Court nominee who sexually, assaulted her. And it can kind of feel really just kind of disparaging, to see that it didn't prevent that from happening. He still got the nominations, but we still have to go back and recognize how much Anita Hill's testimony changed the landscape of the workplace environment, and how much more Dr. Ford's testimony will help us in the future as well.
Thank you so much, Shannon. I really appreciate the background that you have, and and all the expertise that you have. And Anita Hill really put the word sexual harassment into the national consciousness. It just wasn't discussed before. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I want to wait until the Q&A section. I would love to ask Maya to talk about the legal remedies that exist now, because we've heard about the problems that exist now, the definition, and also Shannon did a really good job of talking about how it is privileged to be able to come forward. When I was undocumented, I was sexually harassed at every single job, literally every single job. And that was only one of the types of exploitation that I experienced, because my bosses or my supervisors knew that they could get away with that, because it would have been so much more dangerous for me to try to get some kind of remedy, because it could have meant me ending up in a detention center somewhere, or being forced to leave America. So yes, it is privileged to be able to come forward, because it can be so dangerous for so many women. So Maya, I would love to hear from you about the protection that does exist now, and some of the wonderful resources that the National Women's Law Center has.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Maya Ragu. I'm the Director of Workplace Equality at the National Women's Law Center. We're a national legal advocacy organization working for equality and opportunity for women and girls. And we work across a wide variety of issues like education, childcare, reproductive rights and health, and workplace, which is the area in which I focus. So it's interesting to have a conversation about legal and other remedies for harassment, sort of after taking in what Allegra and Shannon have said, because at the root of this is the fact that our institutions and our legal system is set up to be reactive, right? Someone has to come forward and speak out before there is a response from the workplace and the employer, from the school, or from someone else. And for all the reasons that Shannon just articulated, it is very hard for a lot of people to come forward. Fear for their safety, their reputation, their job, their career prospects, not to mention, personal safety. If you're undocumented, there's a whole host of reasons why people don't come forward. Another big barrier is that a lot of people just don't know that they have rights. They don't know what the law is. What I've found a lot in the last year is either people don't know what their rights are and don't know that they have protections under the law, or the opposite is true. They think they are protected under the law when in fact they're not. So what do I mean by that? Allegra mentioned Title VII, which is one of the major federal civil rights laws that protects people in the workplace. But Title VII has its limits, right? The federal law just provides a minimum sort of baseline of protection. And if you happen to live in states like California or New York City, the states and cities can provide you with more protections above that. So here's one example. A lot of people now don't work in traditional employment relationships where you are considered an employee and you get benefits from your employer, right? A lot of people work in the gig economy. They're independent contractors. They work on their own. And that's just not freelance journalists. It also includes people like domestic workers or farm workers. And if that is how you are classified under the law, you're actually not protected by our federal civil rights law, by Title VII. So you actually don't have those protections, which surprises a lot of people. So there's a lot of work that's been happening for a long time, and I think that continues to need to happen to just make sure people understand what their rights are, even should they choose not to go forward with reporting or to bring a charge or a lawsuit. It's just important that people have that level of information. If you are protected under the law, you know, as Shannon mentioned, because of the way the law is set up, most people have to go to their employer, and if they happen to have an HR department or an HR director, to make a complaint that way and let that internal process take its course. And for all the reasons that we've heard, that is often not satisfactory. You know, HR may not be responsive, and we have to remember that no matter how wonderful or helpful an HR person is, ultimately they work for the company and they are there to protect the company and the employer. So that's important to keep in mind. So a lot of times, you know, sometimes investigations aren't conducted, or, you know, witnesses aren't spoken to, and the situation isn't resolved properly, and there's no accountability and there's no real response, which of course keeps other people from coming forward as well. But going through that internal process is actually really important if someone wants to move forward and then go to the EEOC or a state or local civil rights agency and file a claim. And you have to do that before you can ever file a lawsuit. So, you know, let's recognize that another major issue in terms of people coming forward to enforce their rights is most people can't afford a lawyer, or they don't know how to connect to a lawyer to understand what their rights are. So the National Women's Law Center Fund houses and administers the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which was created in January and is, you know, funded by people all over the world. And the idea is that for people who've experienced workplace sexual harassment or related retaliation, they can come and be connected to lawyers who can give them information about their legal rights and help them think about what their options are if they want to move forward. And then the fund will help defray the cost of bringing lawsuits in certain cases. So that's one option for people. But again, all of this is based on a system that depends on someone coming forward to report. And what's been missing in a lot of the sort of public conversations in the media, right, is how do we prevent this from happening in the first place? That's going to take major changes to our laws, to our culture, to our institutions and our workplaces. And all that needs to be happening at the same time, but through the lens of prevention. So what does that mean? It means we have to be giving businesses, for example, incentives to do more than just comply with the letter of the law, to encourage them to go above and beyond, to make sure prevention is at the center of whatever workplace system that they have in place to address issues. And it's not enough for it to just be about sexual harassment, right? Because number one, people frequently experience other forms of harassment and discrimination along with sexual harassment. Like if you're a woman of color, you might be experiencing racial harassment and sexual harassment, or pay discrimination and sexual harassment. So you can't ignore that these things are happening together, and that for some people, they experience intersectional discrimination. So the best sort of employer responses to get at this culture change and engage in prevention, we're going to take a broad look and address all forms of harassment and discrimination together, and not be limited to just stopping bad things from happening because that's the law, but really, how do you create a workplace that is based on respect and dignity and safety for people? And taking that broader view is what will help companies change their culture and get to that issue of prevention. And as so many people have mentioned today, it's not enough to have a system if there's no buy-in from the company and its leadership. You know, change has to start at the top. So the leadership of that business, of that institution, has to say very clearly, like, yes, I believe in this. We're going to put money behind this. I'm going to, you know, put my name on this and make sure that we're going to carry this program through. And that's really critical because, you know, if managers see that the CEO isn't taking harassment seriously, then they have no incentive to, you know, not harass employees, or when someone complains, to make sure that they're investigating those complaints and taking them to HR and seeing that there is accountability. So that's really important. And this is in the materials that I have put links to in the slides, but, you know, it's not enough just to have a policy, right? Everyone has a sexual harassment policy, but really, what is in that policy? Does anyone know about it? Has anyone read it? Do they understand how it works? What if they want to make a complaint? Where do they go? You'd be surprised how many people never read those policies and just stick them, you know, in a shelf or throw them away or whatever. So it's really important that that just not be a piece of paper on a shelf somewhere, that it has meaning and that employees understand what their rights and responsibilities are. And then training has to go along with that too, but it really has to be effective. And what I mean by that is you can't just buy a DVD and pop it in and have people watch it for 10 minutes and have that be the training. That's not really effective. And if you're showing a DVD, and this happened to me, I was working with an organization made up of farm workers, and I was observing a sexual harassment training that was being given to the farm workers from someone from a state agency. And all the examples she used were of people who were in offices or law firms or corporate offices. And the situations she was describing really weren't relevant to people who work on a farm and their day-to-day experience of harassment and assault. So they were sort of tuning out, and it wasn't really helpful for them. So the key is to make sure that any sort of training is really relevant to that workforce, to that company, and to what's really happening in the day-to-day lives of those employees on the job. And it's best to do in-person training. And another really key issue for prevention is to make people feel like they have a stake in what's happening, right? And so if someone sees something happening and they're a bystander, to help them learn how they can intervene at that moment to either assist someone who's being harassed or assaulted or discriminated against, or to say to the person who's doing the harassment to tell them to stop and to check that behavior before it escalates into something more. And I think that's what's been missing from a lot of the training over the last 20, 25 years. And that's part of what we're seeing in more effective efforts to change workplace culture and move towards a more proactive, preventative approach.
Thank you so much, Maya. That's so helpful. Yeah, we will be sending email with all the resources that the panelists spoke about. And you're always welcome to contact us with any questions you have, and we will find out the answer. But thank you so much for speaking about the prevention piece. I So my background, I spearheaded the sexual harassment and sexual assault policy for the third largest university in the US while I was undocumented. And it was interesting to do that while I was undocumented because I was able to keep in mind the various intersections that women of color, gender non-binary immigrants face when they deal with these issues of these forms of violence. So the effective training is so, so important. The New York Times, about a few months ago, maybe about a year ago, wrote an article that most sexual harassment trainings that are given actually make things worse because they reinforce gender stereotypes of women being victims and men being predators. And when I've led training, sexual harassment training or sexual assault training, I've really used the bystander approach that Maya just mentioned because ending sexual violence and discrimination is everybody's responsibility. And most men are not predators. Let me say that again, most men are not predators. The problem is the predators tend to be serial predators. So a rapist on average will rape at least 6 victims. And that's why the numbers are so skewed. But most men are not predators, but most men don't speak up when they see their fellow men using their male privilege to, whether it's making a lewd comment or catcalling somebody, or something even more benign, where they are not respecting a woman's space and talking over her, not listening to her. So the most effective training really engages everybody and says that it's not a men versus women issue. It's really about creating what Maya mentioned, a work culture where everybody is respected and valued, because studies after studies show work cultures that are more diverse in both gender and racial identity, and where workers feel empowered to make complaints if there's something goes wrong and just speak up, they're more profitable. So even if a company is interested purely in their bottom line, it makes sense to have good policies against any form of discrimination, including bullying. So studies have shown that this was done mostly around male harassers, but men who harassed women were exponentially more likely to be bullies to other men. So predators who do this kind of things, they don't just stop with sexually harassing women. They are preventing also men from being their best at their work. So really, from a bottom line approach, it makes sense for companies to have robust policies and make sure that they're adhered to. I know we have only 6 more minutes, so I want to encourage all of you to send us the questions, tweet at us, email us, and we will gather the answers and send them out to you. Since we have 6 minutes and we have quite a few questions, I want to ask this to Allegra and Maya. So one of the questions we received was actually a real life scenario of an employee in a completely different department who had said to the colleague that he was in love with her. And he quit as soon as he told her, because he realized it may have created a uncomfortable situation for her. Would that be considered sexual harassment? Because since he quit right away.
Well, I don't think that whether he quit or not is really the determinant. You can harass somebody and then quit. But I think a one-time expression of caring for someone else is probably more likely than not sexual harassment. Again, you'd have to look at the whole factual scenario, see if there's previous conduct. Has he said he's loved her multiple times and she said, please don't say this? But a one-time expression, I would not say that that's sexual harassment. And but in my experience, it usually is not an isolated situation. It usually is, a continuing pattern of behavior between two people.
It really depends on the context of that situation. Were those people friends before, or is this something where they were sort of strangers and this guy became obsessed with her and started telling her that he loved her? There's that unwelcomeness aspect that Allegra mentioned before. So those are all the kinds of things that courts take into account into determining whether something was sexual harassment.
Thank you both. Yeah, this was, like I said, this was a real life situation that somebody asked about. And thank you for both of your answers. This, to my knowledge, this was a one-time thing, and there was a friendship there. But really, for us to be critical and looking at the entire situation, I think is really important.
Right. And I don't mean to imply that sexual harassment can't happen between friends in a work context. It's just that from the question, we didn't know, if these two people knew each other beforehand and what had gone on before in terms of their interactions.
Got it. No, that's very helpful. So yeah, there was a friendship. So yeah, it's nuanced. It's very nuanced, and I think having a very good policy to begin with, where things are spelled out, helps everybody. I really worked on that when I worked on the university-wide policy, is really spelling out what does it mean to harass somebody. And the training is just so important, and not having video training, but in-person training. So I'm sorry, I know we have only 2 more minutes. So this question, again, it's kind of a legal question to both you, Allegra and Maya. The pushback that we get often is, does this mean I can't compliment somebody at work anymore? Or does this mean I can't pursue somebody at work anymore, where I'm not being a creep, and like maybe there's a mutual attraction?
It doesn't mean you can never compliment anyone anymore. I think, again, it depends on what is the compliment and what is the context. If you are making compliments, if you're giving someone a compliment and it's about their body, that is potentially, harassing behavior. If you're saying, I like your sweater, that could be fine. It just depends on the context. If you say to someone, you gave a great presentation, that's probably not sexual harassment. But once it starts becoming focused on someone's body or their attributes, their physical attributes, or it's sort of gendered commentary, that's when, and I mean not just based on sex, I mean gender, like gender identity and sexual orientation as well. That's when you start sliding over into where it can be sexual harassment. And in terms of flirting and dating, so first of all, some companies have policies about people dating in the workplace. Sometimes they ban it entirely. Sometimes it depends on whether they work in the same department and whether there's a power relationship, as Allegra mentioned earlier. It's not to say you can, so in some workplaces you can't, but in others you can. But again, this brings up a larger cultural issue as well about consent. Is it unwelcome? So being able to read those cues and respect the other person's decisions and what they're telling you and their actions.
I just want to thank you, Jaren, for having me speak on this webinar, and to close by saying that one of the greatest problems that employees face on the job is feeling isolated, alone, and really sometimes even frightened when they experience sexual harassment or gender-based harassment on the job. It's really important that within the workplace, employees talk to each other so that they can empower themselves. If they need to go to the employer, they will have witnesses and other people who will back up what they are experiencing. This kind of isolation can lead to tremendous emotional distress and anxiety and often push employees out of the job. If employees cannot find redress within their own workplaces, and that is always the best case scenario, to try to get your employer to be responsive to what you're experiencing. We hope that viewers or friends of viewers or acquaintances of viewers of this webinar will contact the Gender Equality Law Center. Both our general information number and our legal hotline are in the written materials that are being sent out with other materials and taping of this webinar. We both represent individuals experiencing sexual harassment on the job, and when we can't, we also serve as a referral network so that people can seek redress for this problem and both preserve the jobs that they are still working, or if they've been pushed out, seek other redress for the problems they're facing, which are usually both economic and emotional distress. So thank you very much, Jaren.
Thank you so much, everybody. We're at 4. We can go on about these issues for hours, but I really appreciate all of your time. We all do. The viewers appreciate it also. As I mentioned, we will be sending out an email with the link to the video along with the resources that the speakers mentioned. And please continue connecting to us with any questions or comments you have. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in.